All right, good morning, everyone. It's now 9 a.m. We're just going to get this meeting kicked off here. Just make sure everybody is on the same page. This is the public meeting for Burroughs Creek, Instream Flow number 1, TF number 37, 1/62. Middle Fork Long Creek, Instream Flow number 1, TF number 37, 2/62. Sheridan Creek, Instream Flow number 1, 37, 6/61. Stonefly Creek, Instream Flow number 1, 37, 5/61. And the West Fork Long Creek Instream Flow segment number 1, 37, 4/61. I am Jason Feltner, representing the Office of the Wyoming State Engineer, and I'll be acting as moderator for this meeting. Just some quick housekeeping. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be available as part of the record. To keep things orderly and to ensure we can tell who is speaking, please keep your microphone muted unless you're asked to unmute and speak. You'll see there's a little, anybody unfamiliar with meets, I'm sure just about everybody's used this, but just in case, there's where the mute button is in the center of your screen. If you have any questions, you can use the chat, which is the button in the lower right-hand corner. I'll be keeping an eye on that. Or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you to see what your questions are. The presenters have asked that you hold your questions for the end of their presentation. There will be a Q&A session at the end of each segment specific to that presentation, and then there will be a general comment and question session at the end of the meeting today. That being said, I just wanted to pop through the agenda real quickly. Again, I'm speaking right now. Del Lobb will be from the Game and Fish Department, will be giving a specific presentation on the biologic study and background of in-stream flows. Chase Tavelli is representing the Water Development Office and will explain their roles. Then Ryan Kohler with Biota Research will present the water availability study. And then we will have any comments at the end there. I don't have anybody scheduled for to give public comment at this time, but that's all right. If something comes up, those members of the public during the meeting, please feel free to raise your hand and let me know, and I'll get you put on at the end. And that'll wrap us up today. So looking at the size of our group, we should be through this fairly smoothly today. So to get us started, I'll kind of just quickly chat about the responsibilities of the SEO. Having been presented with these applications, our role is to determine if the applications meet all the rules, meet the requirements, all the rules and statutory requirements, to take into consideration any public concerns or comments regarding these segments. If everything is the way it needs to be, the state engineer will issue the permit. And then after a period of more than 3 years, we will have an inspection and measurement time, in which case they will be adjudicated and then made part of the, and they'll be complete at that time. So with that, I will yield the floor over to Mr. Lobb to begin the Game and Fish's presentation. But before I do that, are there any general questions about how the meeting should run today, or just anything in general? Seeing none, I will head the floor over to Mr. Lobb. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everyone. Now comes the thrilling part of seeing if I can share my screen appropriately, and then we'll get started. Okay, Jason, are you seeing, what part of my screen are you seeing? Just the entire, just a slide, or are you seeing notes or multiple views?
I just have this slide up here, so
Okay.
looks good.
All right, thanks. All right, so as Jason said, my presentation includes two parts: a brief background and a little bit of history on the Instream Flow program, and then we'll get into the details about the Instream Flow recommendations that Game and Fish made for 5 segments in the Upper Wind River Basin. Except it's, hang on a second, it's not letting me forward. Interesting. All right, so what are you seeing now? Just did it go to a second slide?
It did. We have
Right.
lots of pretty pictures on our
All
screen
right,
now.
so in-stream flow is one of the many beneficial uses recognized by the state of Wyoming. Sorry. Not sure why this isn't working right, but so there are 7 categories of water use recognized by the state: industrial, irrigation, domestic, miscellaneous, stock, municipal, and in-stream flow is one of those as well. And currently there are 21, sorry, there are 21 beneficial uses recognized by the state engineer's office, but historically there were other water right uses, and a document is available to see from the state engineer's office to see what those uses are. The state legislature authorized in-stream flow water rights in 1986, and it's a process that includes checks and balances among 3 agencies, and 4 if you include essentially 4 agencies. Game and Fish is responsible for selecting streams, taking a deep look into what streams are the most critically in need of in-stream flow recommendations. We start with a plan, select specific streams for study and conduct those studies. And then we submit a draft application to the Water Development Commission, who files that application with the state engineer's office, and then that triggers their water availability study, and that study is funded by Game and Fish. The state engineer office holds a public hearing like this one, and then issues a permit decision. And then the Board of Control, after, as Jason mentioned, waiting at least 3 years, it issues a final adjudication decision, just like with any other water right. To date, there have been 149 applications for in-stream flow water rights. 1 was withdrawn. 123 have been permitted or adjudicated, and 25, including the 5 that we're going to be discussing today, are in application stage. In-stream flow water rights are a valuable habitat protection tool. In-stream flow water rights are limited to the minimum amount necessary to maintain or improve the existing fishery, and we'll come back to that point several times. Water rights are held by the state. They're not held by Game and Fish. They're junior to any pre-existing rights, and because it's a non-consumptive use, water is available for other uses once it leaves a segment. And in-stream flow rights cannot be obtained through abandonment. The Wyoming's in-stream flow law states that in-stream flow water rights can come from unappropriated direct flow or storage water. A public hearing like this one is required. Again, the purpose is to identify the minimum amount of water necessary to maintain or improve the existing fishery. And the emphasis is on protection, not on restoration. So what is the minimum flow needed to maintain an existing fishery? Historically, back in the early days of environmental protection and in-stream flow protection, it was thought that the only flow needed was we just need to keep enough water in there to keep fish alive for a short time, and that should be the minimum flow. But river systems are very complex, and a varied flow regime creates the river system. We have flows ranging from flows that don't occur very often, but are important in shaping the valley, maintaining the riparian area and the channel features, and of course, flows for spawning, fish passage, and rearing and growth. But the problem with identifying a flow that only is enough to keep fish alive is that often a minimum flow becomes the maximum flow, and we lose all those other important functions that are provided by the range of flows above the minimum. And so what are the benefits for streams from in-stream flows? Well, currently there are 123 permitted or in adjudicated water rights, and they're protecting 512 miles of Wyoming streams, which isn't a very large percentage of stream miles in Wyoming. It's not even 3%. It's the filings have been done for the most part on important recreational streams, blue and red ribbon trout streams, as well as our native cutthroat trout waters. And they're important for helping keep our native cutthroat and other species potentially off of the threatened and endangered species list. If a fish is added to the endangered species list or a threatened list, then the state of Wyoming loses primacy to the federal government, which then has the ability to manage not only the fish populations, but the water and adjoining lands. So we want to keep fish off those lists so Wyoming has direct control over management of our resources. What hasn't happened with in-stream flow? There's never been a call for regulation associated with an in-stream flow water right. That's because most in-stream flow segments don't affect any existing diversions or water rights, and no existing water right is affected by an in-stream flow water right. So no one has lost a water right to the state. No dams have been built to provide an in-stream flow. Initially, it was thought that in the 80s that we would really need storage to provide low flows during the summer to meet in-stream flow requirements, but that hasn't been the case. And a big reason for that is Game and Fish wants to maintain as much free-flowing stream habitat as possible. There have been no valid claims of injury associated with an in-stream flow segment, and by law, in-stream flow water rights cannot affect interstate compacts and decrees. In-stream flow water rights aren't just for fish, they're for people. Just like any other water right, it's a legal means of protecting flows, and 48% of Wyoming residents fish, and so those water rights benefit those fish. And water rights are also enhance sightseeing, hiking, camping, and are important to the citizens of the state and the people that visit our state. So that's a quick summary of the in-stream flow program. If you want more information, feel free to give me a call or send me an email, but maybe a better place to start is on our website under the Extreme Angler page. Posted our 2 brochures that we created last year. One is a fairly long brochure on the in-stream flow water rights in Wyoming. It goes through the history and the process that I just touched on today. And there's a shorter brochure that talks about why stream flows are important for fish and for people. All right, so with that, we can move into the specifics on the recommendations for 5 stream segments in the Upper Wind River Basin. The creeks that we're looking at, like Jason mentioned, are Burrows, Middle Fork Long, Sheridan, Stonefly, and West Fork Long Creek. Those 5 stream segments are northwest and north of Du Bois in the Upper Wind River Basin. In total, the segments add up to 20.03 miles of proposed in-stream flow segments. And why did we select these streams? Well, they're critical habitat for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, which is the Wyoming species of greatest conservation need. Historically, Yellowstone cutthroat trout were much more widespread in northwest Wyoming than they are today, but because of habitat modifications and competition and hybridization with non-native trout, they're just limited to headwater reaches that are isolated from each other. And so the more we can protect these isolated headwater streams, the better chance we have of keeping Yellowstone cutthroat trout off the endangered species list. So what are the methods that Game and Fish uses? Well, we have a rigorous set of methods that we use over the course of a summer field season as snowmelt recedes and goes to late summer flows. For these 5 stream segments, we use 3 field methods and 1 hydrologic method. For the field methods, we measure habitat characteristics at 3 flows. And then we use some habitat models, mathematical models, to predict changes at the flows we measured, but also at flows that we didn't measure. And then we use the results of that modeling to identify the minimum flow levels that maintain habitat for all trout stages on a seasonal basis. The first of the 3 field methods we used is called PHAB-SIM, which stands for Physical Habitat Simulation. And we simulate habitat availability through a range of flows of interest, and from low flows to fairly high flows. We start by establishing transects across important habitats in a stream site. And then at those transects, we measure a lot of depths and velocities, and we identify the wetted substrate at several transects at all 3 flows. And we use that information to calibrate a hydraulic model that links all of the transects together. And then we can predict depth, velocity, and wetted substrate distributions, not just at the flows we measured, but at flows that we weren't able to measure. And then we take those predicted depths and velocities and substrates and compare them to information that we have on what cutthroat trout need for adult and juvenile habitat, as well as for spawning habitat. And from that, for any flow, we can determine what the suitable habitat area is that's available. And we do that for the flows we measured, but also throughout the range of flows that we didn't measure. So that wrapped it up for the PHAB-SIM method. We'll talk about the results a little bit for one of the segments. The second method we use is the habitat retention method. It's a simple hydraulic model, and it's only on riffle transects. And so the modeling isn't linked to other transects, so that's what makes it simple. And for any flow, we can calculate average depth, average velocity, and wetted perimeter. And wetted perimeter is the distance along the bottom of the stream bed across the stream. So it's always a little bit more, sometimes a lot more than the wetted width of a channel, but it's very similar to wetted width. And so for each flow, we where we want to calculate information for, we have an average depth, an average velocity, and a wetted perimeter. And then for each flow, we compare that to criteria that we have for fish passage and invertebrate habitat. And we identify what flow is the lowest flow that meets at least 2 of those criteria, and that would be the recommended flow. And the third method we use is called the Habitat Quality Index, or HQI. HQI is a verified method that was specifically developed for Wyoming streams. It was developed in the 70s and 80s and has been used effectively since then. It uses 9 different variables throughout a stream reach that look at different aspects of trout habitat in streams. Looks at flow conditions, maximum water temperature during the summer, a water quality variable and nitrate and nitrogen, bank conditions, specifically the percentage of eroding banks, fish food abundance, and most important for looking at it, 3 flows, or trout cover, stream width, and stream velocities. We've got those 9 variables. We measure all of them, but we measure cover, width, and velocity at 3 flows. And then from that, we can predict how many trout habitat units there are at flows we were not able to measure. And finally, we do some monitoring. That the summer we're out there collecting habitat information. We're also have a pressure transducer out there monitoring stage, and we measure discharge, and we can develop a stage discharge relationship and predict and estimate what flow conditions we're at during the summer, even when we weren't there. And from that, we use a regional regression analysis, which is similar to methods that Biota will be talking about. Ryan Collier of Biota will be talking about. They do some other things as well, but it's a very similar approach on what we do. And we need that information to the HQI and the habitat retention method involve some hydrologic statistics to complete the methodology. So we need to do this regional regression analysis to support those methods, but we also use them to calculate monthly 20% exceedance flows during the winter, which we use for our natural winter flow analysis for assessing overwinter survival flow needs in the stream. And so we've identified that there are different needs for flows by the fishery throughout the year. So we separate the hydrograph into 3 seasons: overwinter survival, spring connectivity and spawning, and summer rearing and growth. The wiggly graph lines below those descriptions of the seasons are maximum 20% exceedance and mean flows. And it's just an indication to show you how much flow varies throughout the year and how we delineate the seasons. And the seasons are based on not only the hydrology, but the life history needs of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So we have several seasons and we have several methods, but not all methods apply to each season. So for winter, we use the natural winter flow hydrologic analysis for identifying overwinter survival needs. And we use the habitat retention method for fish passage or connectivity between habitats. In the spring, again, connectivity is very important. And we use that physical habitat simulation method for assessing availability of adult and juvenile trout habitat, as well as spawning habitat availability. And in the summer, the methods that are most appropriate are the habitat retention and habitat quality index. And that's what we use for these sites. In other systems, sometimes the PAB sim becomes important in the summer months, but for these 5 segments, we focused on habitat retention and habitat quality index. So now I'm going to just give you an example of how we use those methods on one of the creeks, go into more detail on it, and then I'll show the the results from Burroughs Creek and then the results for all the creeks. So we won't go through the details for each segment, but if you want that detail, I can certainly get it to you. So for Burroughs Creek, we select a site, and for all the sites, we select a site to represent the entire segment that we've identified. Typically, it's closer to the downstream end, but not always. And for Burroughs Creek, for the natural winter flow analysis, for making a recommendation for winter, we looked at the 20% exceedance flows for October through April. We calculated the average of that. So for this method, the recommended flow for winter would be 3.2 CFS. But as I pointed out, we also used the habitat retention to look at flow needs during the winter. And this is a results for 3 different flows from the habitat retention method. You can see that at the very bottom of the graph at 2 CFS, that the average depth criterion was met, and that's the 0.3 in bold. So that equaled or exceeded the criterion of 0.2 feet average depth. And then when you go up to 4 CFS, you see that at 4 is the lowest flow that met the average velocity criterion of greater than or equal to 1 foot per second. And so that becomes our recommendation from the habitat retention method. The 2 criteria are met. That's 4 CFS. 4 CFS is greater than the 3.2 CFS from the natural winter flow analysis. So the recommended flow for winter is 4 CFS. For spring, that's where we look at the PEB-SIM results. As a reminder, PEB-SIM is where we have several transects in different habitat types. We measure depths and velocities and wetted substrate distributions, and then we estimate available suitable habitat area. And this graph is based on percentage of the maximum habitat available from the modeling. And you can see that if you look at the grayish lines, those are for adult and juvenile habitat, that the peak habitat availability occurs around 9 to 12 or 13 CFS. So that flow would be good for adult and juvenile habitat. But then if you look at the blue line for spawning Yellowstone cutthroat trout habitat, you see that doesn't peak until about 23 CFS. So to make sure that we provide habitat conditions for adult, juvenile, and spawning Yellowstone cutthroat trout, the recommended flow from the physical habitat simulation is 23 CFS. So we will provide spawning habitat as well as adult and juvenile habitat with that flow. And the final season is summer, and we had the habitat retention method results that we looked at, but the HQI results were, if you remember, 4 CFS was the habitat retention method result, and we'll see what we come up with the HQI. So we've got, from our modeling, we've got habitat units that are available at different flows. You can see that at the far left at 2 CFS, we have about 70 habitat units. And at the far right at 6.2 CFS, we have about double that, around 140 habitat units. For the HQI method, what we do is we identify from our hydrologic analysis what is a 20% exceedance flow for late summer. And in this case, for Burroughs Creek, it was 4.8 CFS. And then we look to find what is the lowest flow that provides the same amount of habitat units as that late summer flow. And so for Burroughs Creek, that's 4.1 CFS. And that became our recommendation for summer conditions, protecting long-term trout habitat in late summer for Burroughs Creek. And so to put that all together, the flow recommendations are for natural flows up to these recommended flows. Naturally, they won't always be available, we know that. For winter, Using the habitat retention method, we have a 4 CFS recommendation. For spring, the recommendation is 23 CFS as a result of the PHAB SIM modeling. And for summer, HQI results were 4.1 CFS. And then we compare those recommendations to our estimates of hydrology, and this is our estimates of Burroughs Creek hydrology from our regional regression analysis. And you can see the yellow line is, for the most part, it's below the estimated hydrology. You can see that around May that our recommended flow is the maximum flow is a little bit below our recommended flow, but again, we're not expecting the flow of 23 CFS to be available every year for the entire May 1st through July 15th period. Naturally, we know that doesn't happen, but we do expect that most years that at some point there will be a flow of 23 CFS, and we want to protect that flow when it does occur. So Yellowstone cutthroat trout will have the opportunity to spawn, and that there'll be habitat for rearing, for egg hatching and for rearing the larval fish. So that wraps it up for Burroughs Creek, and here's the results for all 5 segments that for all seasons that we're made our recommendations for. So for winter, we looked at all 5 seasons, all 5 segments, identified the seasons based on the life history of Yellowstone cutthroat trout and the existing hydrology estimates that we developed, identified these important seasonal periods, made recommendations that we think will maintain overwinter survival of Yellowstone cutthroat trout, provide spawning habitat, as well as rearing and egg hatching and rearing habitat during the spring. And during the summer, we'll provide conditions that over the long term will keep a productive trout fishery by providing good growth during the late summer period, growth and survival during the late summer period. And these flows will also provide passage year round for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So the proposed in-stream flow water rights will protect existing unappropriated base flow conditions. All pre-existing water rights will be protected, and these recommendations will maintain critical flows needed for spawning, passage, and year-round survival of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in 20 miles of 5 streams in the Upper Wind River Basin. If you want more details on the studies or in-stream flow segments, give me a call, send me an email. But our website, again, that Extreme Angler website, has a lot of information about the sites. Those little red teardrops, upside down teardrops, you can click on those and it will take you to a segment, and you can find a map that shows the segment location and directions on how to get to the segment. It also includes some information about the segment and the rationale for the proposed in-stream flow water right. And also you can access the report for each segment, the biological report that Game and Fish completed for each segment. So I know I went through that pretty quickly, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that folks have about these segments.
All right, Del, it doesn't look like anybody is got a little echo going on there. It doesn't look like anybody has any questions at this time.
Sounds good.
Right, so I will ask Chase to come on now. Thank you, Del.
Sure thing.
Okay, now it's my turn to try to share. I think Del has to stop sharing, I think. Okay, window. Bear with me here, everybody. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Is that correct? That's
Yep, it
our,
looks good.
yeah, that's our homepage for the Instream Flow site. You can see that, Jason?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, so we see what Game and Fish does. When they're done with their work, they fill out an application and turn it into the Water Development Office. I then take that application and review it and make sure it's complete and accurate, just kind of a final check. And I take that to the state engineer's office and file the application in the name of the Water Development Commission, because the state is the applicant for all in-stream flow water rights. That establishes the water right priority date. By statute, this then triggers a feasibility study that the WWO conducts. My office, with the help of the state engineer's office and Game and Fish, hires a consultant. I then manage the work in the project. For this particular study, we contracted with Biota Research and Consulting out of Jackson. Biota completed the study, and we'll discuss the results of that study today. To date, we have done 54 hydrologic studies on 149 in-stream flow segments. 25 of those segments are still remaining in the application stage. That includes the 5 we're discussing today. The remaining of the 149 have a status of permitted, adjudicated via arbitral petition, and 1 has been withdrawn. If you take a look over at the website that should be showing up, excuse me, sorry. You can see reference to where hydrologic studies can be found. The biological reports can be found here as well. Those are what the Game and Fish puts together. There's a nice map here. The link does work. I have to update Google. You can click on this, and it'll take you to a map where you can click on specific segments to get information. It's a link to the Extreme Angler Program, history, what it provides and prohibits, and what's most important is here you can go see what each filing has. So temporary filing date, priority date. As things progress, these will be filled out, and you can also access the biological assessment here early on in the process. After we have a report done, then you'll have a hydrologic study. It demonstrates the flows that are being requested for each time period. If you look up here, this is the website address if you're interested, or you can simply search on State of Wyoming in-stream flow filings and look for the link that has WWDC in it. For additional information, if you scroll down here, you can click on my name, and it will bring up my contact information. That's basically our process. Pretty short and sweet. Are there any questions for me?
Okay, I'm not seeing any. Chase, thank you very much for that introduction there. And then Ryan, are you available to get started?
Absolutely.
All right, then I'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just getting set up here. Make sure everyone can see a map as it loads.
It looks good, Ryan. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Ryan Collier with Biota Research and Consulting, based out of Jackson. like Chase mentioned, we were contracted to do the feasibility study to look into the hydrology of these 5 segments and calculate mean monthly flows and availability of flows for the periods of time that the requests were made. So like was mentioned, we have these 5 study segments depicted here, north and northwest of Du Bois. We have the summary of the temporary filing numbers and in-stream flow requests by segment that Dill talked about. And then we have a very specific scope of work put forth by the Water Development Office, as Chase was discussing, a scope of work that's put out in an RFP, and it contains about 10 or 12 distinct tasks. The first being meetings, including this meeting. Also, we held a kickoff meeting that was open to the public when the project started. That was held virtually, of course, due to COVID. But regular meetings also with the Water Development Office to maintain transparency and review and approval of the scope and method as it was advanced. Second task was a mapping effort, a GIS effort, where we provide maps that depict the existing characteristics and attributes and locations of topics of interest pertinent to these 5 study segments. So here's a map that shows the study segments themselves in red, the study area basin or catchments in the dark hatch, and then the existing water rights, which leads to task 3, where we look at documenting, researching and documenting existing and canceled water rights that would be pertinent to the in-stream flow study segments and that would be located within the basins associated with those study segments. In these 5 study segments, there were about 5 water rights summarized here within the study area basins. 3 of them are canceled, so no longer applicable, and 2 of them are actually in-stream flows for livestock watering. So not a depletion of water within the basin, but just a water right to maintain livestock water. So having documented the water rights applicable to the study areas, we move into task 4, which is an effort to obtain records for any flow, diversion, storage, and other data pertinent to flows within the study segments. And then we move into task 5, which is looking at flow measurements, which ultimately informs task 6, which is a hydrologic analysis to calculate existing in-stream flows, unappropriated water rights that would be applicable to the requested in-stream flow rights. So the flow measurement task is basically setting up temporary stream gauge sites within each study segment as close to the downstream extent of the study segment as possible. Those stream gauges are equipped with a staff plate so we can read the stream water surface elevation or the stage. They're also equipped with a data logger that records that stage at 15-minute intervals throughout the deployment period, which is basically from June until October, sometimes May to October, but dependent on site access. We then visit each gauge at least 6 times during that period, and we measure discharge in terms of cubic feet per second, and we record the stage during that discharge measurement. Those data points depicted here in the upper right are then used to generate a correlation between stage and discharge, which we then use to translate all the data logger recordings of stage to discharge. So we can develop a detailed hydrograph as shown in the bottom left here that shows discharge at 15-minute intervals throughout the deployment period, shows mean daily flow in the black dots, and it shows those calibration measurements in the red stars. And so we do that for each of the 5 study segments to develop this hydrograph. And then we identify what's called a reference gauge, which is an existing stream gauge, in this case maintained by the USGS on the Wind River. And we use the data that we recorded at our temporary gauging stations in the study segments to correlate flows in the study segment to the reference gauge. And these are the relationships here shown for the 5 study segments. We were using data from the 5th, the 15th, and the 25th of each month to correlate flows in the study segment to the reference gauge. And then we use that mathematical relationship between the 2 sites to basically translate data from the reference gauge to the study segments. So we look for a reference gauge that has a long period of record, typically at least 30 years. And then we can translate various attributes, hydrologic attributes from that reference gauge to the study segments, including mean monthly flows that were recorded and calculated at the reference gauge, and also daily flows from the whole period of record. The hydrology analysis includes 2 methodologies, one being the concurrent discharge method, which we just talked about, and the second being the regional regression equations. And what these are, there's a set of equations applicable to various regions in Wyoming that calculate various hydrologic attributes, including monthly flows, mean annual flows, those types of attributes for streams in Wyoming based upon various physical characteristics of the basins, including mean elevation, precipitation, stream length, channel width. So what we do is we look at all the available regional regression equations and we see which one most accurately represents the reference gauge based on the data that's available from that reference gauge. And in this case, you can see highlighted in bold in the table on the bottom left, it was an equation from Mycelis, who wrote the paper that basically calculated the mean annual flow at the Wind River USGS gauge based upon drainage area. And looking at the actual data from that gauge, the regional regression equation was within about 3% in terms of accuracy of predicting that mean annual flow. So that regional regression equation is most reflective of the USGS gauge and therefore believed to be most reflective of the study segments that are located within the same basin. So we then use that regional regression equation to basically translate available data from the USGS gauge to the reference or to the study segments, including mean monthly flows and mean daily flows from the period of record from average years within that period of record. So we've got 2 methodologies. We apply them both. And this is a table that demonstrates the results for each of the 5 study segments from the 2 methodologies. So if we start at Burroughs Creek at the top, the regional regression equation results for mean monthly flows are depicted, and then the results from the concurrent discharge or the temporary gauge site are depicted. And then what we do, you can see the variability between the methods. In this case, for example, in January, the regional regression equations predict 2.2 cubic feet per second, and the concurrent discharge method predicts 4.2 cubic feet per second. So we then average those results based upon the error anticipated to be applicable within each methodology. So it's a weighted average based upon methodological error. And we come up with that weighted average result of mean monthly flows throughout the year within the study segments. The next step is to look at unappropriated flows within those study segments. So we have the weighted average result. We subtract appropriated flows, which in this case, there are not any. We would apply return flows if there were appropriated flows that were, say, associated with a diversion and flood irrigation. We would anticipate some return flows, but in this case, there aren't any. We then come up with the unappropriated direct flows, which is the same as the mean monthly flows from the weighted average. We apply the Instream Flow request, and we look at whether there's a shortage or a surplus. So we have here slides for each of the stream segments. This is Burroughs Creek, and you can see the unappropriated direct flows in the chart are in blue, and the Instream Flow request by month is depicted in red. And so with a visual graphic like this, we can present whether there is sufficient unappropriated direct flow to satisfy the Instream Flow request by month. So wherever the red bars are higher, taller than the blue bars, that is where the request exceeds the availability of flow based on mean monthly flows in average years. And so Burroughs Creek generally has a shortage in January, February, slight one in March, and then May, early July, and it's close in December. And so we can run through this same presentation for each of the 5 study segments. This is Middle Fork Long Creek. Again, a shortage in the winter months. This is the result for Sheridan Creek. There's a surplus of flow available based on mean monthly flows throughout the year when looking at the Instream Flow request. This is Stonefly Creek, also a surplus of flows available for each month of the year. This is West Fork Long Creek, where there is a shortage of flows based on the Instream Flow request for the late summer and winter months. So the next task in the scope is to do a storage analysis and determine whether there are any viable storage opportunities to store flows when there's a surplus and release those flows when there's a shortage during the year to satisfy the request. In this case, for the 5 study segments, we did not identify any feasible storage opportunities. Then the next task is the daily exceedance analysis. And this uses the same methodologies, the concurrent discharge and the regional regression equations, but instead of looking at mean monthly flows or the average flows experienced in each month of the year, this looks at daily flows from the period of record within each month. And that's used to develop these flow duration curves for each month, which basically says in the top example here, in November, based on all the daily recorded flows in November from the USGS gauge translated to the study segment using the 2 methodologies, what percentage of time within November are the flows at various levels? And so you can see the percentage of time on the x-axis and the flow rate on the y-axis. And so, for example, you can see there's 4 CFS in the stream in November, about 60% of the time. And these flow duration curves are then overlaid with the Instream Flow request to identify what percentage of the time, in this case in November, is there more flow than the Instream Flow request. And you can see in this case for November, Burroughs Creek, the Instream Flow request corresponds to about an 80% flow duration, which means that 80% of the time there is the Instream Flow request or more water within the segment. And then there's another example here for January in Middle Fork Long Creek, just demonstrating a different result, showing that the Instream Flow request is up around 2.4 cubic feet per second. And based on this analysis, at no time in January, based on the period of record, is there more than about 1.5 cubic feet per second available within the Middle Fork Long Creek study segment. So we have 12 or 13 graphs because July is typically split into 2 portions for each of the 5 study segments, and those are presented in the feasibility study, which is available, as Chase mentioned, on the website. Instead of going through all the graphs, here we have a summary table that is depicting by month and by each of the 5 study segments what the Instream Flow request is initially, and then what the percent exceedance is of that request based on this analysis by month. And so that's showing in green here when the Instream Flow request is 20% or greater in terms of exceedance, it's in green. When that request is experienced less than 20% of the time, the result is depicted in red, showing the actual percent of the flow duration by result. So you can see Burroughs Creek, the percentages are all green. There's a surplus. Middle Fork Long Creek, there's a few periods in the late summer, August and winter when the Instream Flow request exceeds the 20%. It's greater than the availability of the 20% flow. In Sheridan Creek, you can see the Instream Flow request is below the 20% exceedance. So there's an availability or surplus of flows throughout the year. In Stonefly Creek, similar result. There is an availability of flows that exceeds the requested in-stream flow amount throughout the year. And in West Fork Long Creek, again, you can see the shortage in August, late summer, and winter of flows to satisfy the in-stream flow request. And again, these results, we're kind of moving quickly through a lot of tables and graphs, but these results will all be available in the feasibility report that is contained on the Water Development Office website that Chase was talking about. And so with that, I can certainly entertain any questions.
Okay, I see Chase has got his hand up there, so.
Yeah, I want to point one thing out. Ryan is referring to the availability of that report being on the website. It will not be available for at least a month and a half. We have to wait until the comment period is over for this hearing. We'll grab all of the comments that might be available and put them in appendix, and then we'll go through a process of QA/QC of that final report. And once we finalize everything, then yes, it indeed will be on the website.
Chase, this is Jason. I'm assuming though that if someone wanted to see that draft document, it'd be all right if I handed that out.
We're not inclined to pass out draft materials just because it is draft and subject to change. We hate to see a potential mistake that is caught later on that goes out to the public, and then the public believes that that is the final answer, and then they see a draft report with a different response. So we try not to hand out draft reports.
Okay.
But I'm more than willing to discuss anything with anybody if they have questions, and I can help out in that respect.
Okay. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay, seeing none. At this point, I would have had the pre-scheduled comments, but we don't have any. So I will open the floor up for anybody who has any additional public comments or questions they would like to make part of the record. And all is quiet. So with that being said, just wrap things up here. In closing, there is a public comment period which runs for 30 days, which is through the 9th of July. Those comments can be sent directly to me. Again, I'm Jason Feltner. The email address is just my name, which is jason.feltner@wyo.gov. Or you can mail them to us here at the Wyoming State Engineer's office. Send them to my attention. We're in Herschler Building 2 West, so that's 2-W, Cheyenne, Wyoming 82002. Again, postmarks must be made by July 9th for them to be considered. After that period, the state engineer will determine if all the requirements of the applications have been met and that they're in the public interest, in which case, if that determination is made, they will be permitted. And I open up, and with that, I will close the meeting today. Thank you for everyone for joining, and have a great day.